Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 37 of Future Strong. My name's Nikki Garchea, and I'm one of the co-hosts of Future Strong and also a co-founder of Capfinity. Capfinity is a talent acquisition and management company specializing in Gen Z. And as always, for at least some people who've been following the last 37 episodes, we are always joined by the wonderful Lindsay Pollack, and today by Mary Scott. But first of all, Lindsay, how are you doing?
Nikki, I'm doing great. I'm glad it's Friday. It's spring in New York, and we have an amazing guest. We should probably tell everybody. Oh, hi, everybody. I'm Lindsay Pollack. I'm an author of 4 books. My latest is Recalculating. I am a proud ambassador for Capfinity. And we should tell everybody that we pre-gamed this episode with Mary earlier in the week and had a lot of really fascinating conversations that, Nikki, I'm very excited to get to. Everybody, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us where you are watching from. And I have a feeling we're going to get a lot of questions for Mary today. So please feel free to start posting those in the chat. Nikki.
Wonderful. So, Mary, please introduce yourself. Tell everyone about your background. We're absolutely delighted to have you on this show.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this all week, especially after our pregame on Wednesday. My name is Mary Scott. I'm managing consultant at Scott Resource Group, which I'm sure everybody can figure out is my own firm. I come to consulting, which is my major offering, if you will, by way of what in hindsight looks like a brilliant career trajectory that I laid out. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. There was a lot of serendipity in terms of how my career unfolded. But I started in college admissions at my undergraduate alma mater, which at the time was a small women's college. It has since gone co-ed, as most small women's colleges did. But I thoroughly enjoyed, and I think that's when I first got recruiting of students in my blood, although at the time it was certainly high school students. But from there, just as life unfolds, happened to be working on a high school reunion. And one of the people on that reunion committee was a director of recruiting at a local insurance company, Aetna Life and Casualty at the time, long since gone, or reimagined, repositioned. But he had an opening for a systems recruiter. And I won't get into my sorry academic history in math and science, but which I have rectified since then, I hasten to add. But he recruited me to be a recruiter for systems and worked at Aetna Life and Casualty, eventually became director of what was called staffing at the time, had a team of 67 people, which encompassed not only university recruiting, but the whole experienced recruiting landscape, temporary employment, management development, you name it, I had it. And I decided after doing that for a while that I wanted to do something else with my life. And that's how I got into the consulting business and never looked back. It's been something that I've thoroughly enjoyed. What I do essentially is to work with primarily employers, although I have done work with groups of university career centers, some professional organizations, to essentially help them assess their current state, what's working, what's not, some solutions for the road forward. And I'm the proverbial external set of eyes and hands on occasion that help organizations figure out from an unbiased, unfiltered perspective what they need to address. I'm probably better known for something that I've been doing for decades now, which is conducting campus research. It's something that I got into in the early 90s, which interestingly enough, AT&T, which was one of my clients, wanted to surface data on, yes, diversity recruiting, and they didn't have the budget, story of my life, but they didn't have the budget to fund the project. So we did what we call dialing for dollars and assembled a group of 15 or 20 employers that were also interested in the topic. And that's how I got started in doing campus research. And it's not just fielding, elusive verb, fielding surveys, but focus groups. And I think I was telling Lindsay and Nikki the other day that one of the big challenges for me over the past couple of years has been not able to conduct live discussions with students. And it's not that I couldn't do them virtually, I can, But where I take my cues are the body language, and you don't see that on Zoom. And I also pay a lot of attention to eye rolls because that's where I get a lot of data. And I tend to reinvent surveys as I'm fielding them because of that kind of feedback that I get. So that's a long way around talking about who I am and what I do. But what differentiates me, and a few in the audience know this about me, I'm regarded as a skunk at the garden party. I've also been called the lone wolf crying in the wilderness. And I have a tendency to identify elephants in the room. And a friend of mine at UConn, University of Connecticut, mentioned that she thought it was curious that so many of these terms for me are animals. I'm not quite sure what that's all about, but at any rate, my point is that I tend to identify things that are not the conventional wisdom. I have challenged that for my entire profession, and we're dealing with a lot of it right now. So I will cede the floor at this point, but I know we're going to be talking more about that in terms of the kinds of data that I surface that you're just not hearing elsewhere and why that is.
So as all of you know who watch this show frequently, I take a lot of notes during our sessions, and my notes currently say eye roll, skunk, elephant. So I'm going to come across these in a few months and say, what was I writing down? I want to counter the skunk characterization because we have some self-proclaimed members of the Mary Scott fan club in the audience today. So I'm going to call them out. Welcome to our friend Manny Contaminolis from Cambridge. We have Tahani from Bloomington, Indiana, Delba from Brazil, our friend Jeffrey Morris from the Chicago area, Janice from Detroit, also Trudy Steinfeld from Cambridge, Dave Ong, the founding member of the Mary Scott fan club. Dave, thank you for calling that out. We've got Brooklyn from Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan, James from Birmingham in the UK, Elaine from the Canary Islands, Sachin from India, Dan Black from New York, Roxanne Horry in Brooklyn today. We have quite the crew, Michael from Greater Washington, D.C., Latoya from Florida. Mary, you have quite the fan club of attendees for your skunky elephantine comments today. And I do want to say that our little nutmeg state of Connecticut does not get a lot of love. And I just want to say thank you for serving. I was born and bred in Connecticut as well. We are grateful for your service to the third smallest state in the Union. Nikki.
I mean, where do you take it from there? What I'm loving is there's some people, James Godanifer, who I saw earlier today, is listening in. Thank you, James, in a new role at Towers Watson, and old colleagues with Dan Black. So we've got all kinds of connections happening in the comments. Mary, I like to think you get the things that are under the table on the table. So I don't think I've got any more animal analogies for you, but I like the things that you bring up, and I really love the conversations we've been having. On that topic, Lindsay and I would love for you to share what is currently keeping you awake at night, the things that you're happy to share in such a public forum, and those of us going to NACE are going to whisper to you once we get you in person.
Well, when I first contemplated that question, my initial response was the noise, but I was relating it to the construction site behind our house. There's a new housing development, but that, truth be told, that's not what keeps me awake at 3 a.m, at least not yet. But what does keep me awake, and I mean this very honestly, I take our profession very seriously, and I know we're at an inflection point. And frankly, it's the noise of all the solutions and research and data. And it's not just our profession. I think we're all living this in every aspect of our lives, whether it be the pandemic, return to work. There are just loads of conflicting storylines, a lot of agendas, a lot of narratives that I would strongly encourage everybody on this call to just be an informed consumer of research and be skeptical. And I will give you what I thought was the best example. And I just happened to cross this just about a month ago. I happened to be walking through my office and I had the TV on, and it was on a news station. And along the crawl at the bottom, there was this data that 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds refused to return to the office. And I thought, well, that's certainly attention grabbing. I'm sure that has a lot of tongues wagging. But then I thought, 18 to 24-year-olds have never worked in an office. even the 22 to 24-year-olds have never worked in an office because of the past 2 years. Yet this data was claiming that 70% of them refused to return to the office. And I know that's a popular narrative, but I think we need to be careful in terms of making decisions based on noise. And in the chat, I know that Haley was going to post a link to an op-ed that I wrote for NACE back in 2018, before the pandemic, a full year in advance. And my point at that point was to beware of the conventional wisdom. And I've been writing about this for 20 years. This is not breaking news. But there are so many, again, competing interests and so many agendas that just be skeptical in what you read and just sort through the noise. So that's, I'll get off my soapbox, but that is what keeps me awake at night, because I know that an awful lot of employers and career centers, for that matter, are making decisions based on some research and data and articles that they just need to take a step back and think about.
Just on that, Mary, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. And Capfinity CEO Alex Linley would be like jumping up and down right now because it's very dear to his heart. For you, where do you find are good sources of kind of, and I want to say truth, but truth is so hard to find at the moment, but where do you go to kind of stay informed? Obviously, Dave Ong is on, so NACE is number one, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that goes without saying. Absolutely. I'm a voracious reader. My undergraduate degree was in English, and I've never given it up. And I've always, whether it be reading or podcasts or just things that I listen to, try to expose myself to as many different points of view as I can. And there's some that I'm a big fan of the Wall Street Journal. I have been for years. In fact, that was one of the reasons that I got my MBA in finance, because back early in my career, I had an aunt who was a huge Wall Street Journal fan, and I couldn't keep up with her. And I thought, I really need to get some education here to figure out what she's talking about. But I try to identify bias when I see it. And I've made something of a sport, I won't share any details here, of just kind of busting some of the stuff that I read. So my answer to your question, Nikki, is that I try to take a really broad swath and read stuff that I normally would not read to just get different perspectives. I will say that I follow the LinkedIn feed just in terms of getting a sense as to what are the hot topics. And yesterday, one of the articles in my feed was that the 4-day work week is apparently not going to work. Last week it was going to work. So it's just, those are the kinds of things that I talk about, the noise. It's just, I know that everybody's trying to publish stuff that's going to get clicks, but we just need to be very, hate to use the term suspicious, but I think there's some of that in terms of how we consume what we read and hear.
I think that's such wise advice, Mary. Nikki, Davon mentioned that the check is in the mail for all of our NACE plugging. So just check.
Beer's on you, Dave.
We haven't got to plug Mary's presentation yet, but it is coming.
It is the same day as I believe our presentation, Nikki. I believe they're on the same day. So
depends what time zone you're working on.
Yes. So we will get all of our plugs in for all of our presentations. And those who attend are more likely to be guests on Future Strong in the future. So kidding. Mary, my colleague Eric Stetson from 4Block, the nonprofit that supports veteran career transition, is curious if you know your Enneagram style. And I have a feeling your number one Clifton strength, the same as mine, which is input, which is that we just like to get information from as many places as possible. While you're pondering that question, let's talk about the topics that appear in those LinkedIn feeds, right? Hybrid interviewing, hybrid work, video interviewing, the Great Resignation. We're all familiar with these themes. You've been a recruiter. You work with recruiters. If you were recruiting right now, as many of the people watching are, what would be your advice? And I know this will be a multi-pronged question, but where would your thinking be? What would you continue from the past? What would you be changing? Just how would you strategize recruiting in this really, really unique time?
Right. I'd start with my typical response when I'm asked about hybrid anything, which is hybrid is one of those terms, define it as you will. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we're all struggling with clarity on this, that everyone seems to bring a different headset to hybrid. And many times that morphs into flexibility, which is a totally, not unrelated, but totally different topic altogether. But in terms of hybrid, my advice to employers and recruiters in particular is to take a long, hard look at this past semester. It didn't unfold the way anybody thought it was going to, but there are some lessons learned. And I know from my own data, frankly, this is not a surprise because I've seen this trend building over 2 years, is that students are far more positively impressed by in-person connections than they are by virtual. And I say that stating full well that virtual has a lot of advantages, not the least of which are convenience. That is one thing that I've seen reported repeatedly, and I would concur with. But one of my elephants in the room is that the issues that a lot of employers dealt with this past semester that had to do with an applicant pool that didn't, from a quantity standpoint, measure up to what they were expecting or the effort that they were investing in it, as well as declined offers, reneged offers. There's a lot going on under the surface that has to do with students' lack of satisfaction with their virtual experience. And it comes down to the candidate experience is something that I've been developing data on for, again, 2 years. And obviously, let me state another, I'm going to start a pachyderm farm, another elephant in the room, which is that was all we had for a year was virtual. And I give employers all the credit in the world for making it work, especially as regards internships. And there's a lot to recommend using pieces of it going forward. But I thoroughly encourage employers to take a very clear-eyed look at their own results from this past fall, to take the blinders off and to do a real hard-nosed assessment of what returned on their investment and what didn't, and to leverage what's working and to throw everything else overboard. I know that a lot of employers have tons of money to invest these days, and there's been a let's try this. Well, now's the time to figure out what met expectations and what didn't, because from a student standpoint, a lot of what they experienced did not meet their expectations. So that's the first thing. The second, and it's related, is I did a lot of research over the past year with employers and with career centers for 2 white papers. One's finished, one's still a work in progress. And my premise was this: agnostic campus recruiting is more better. And the reason I wanted to get into that was that students have been complaining about the fact that they've been inundated with outreach from employers. And a couple of quick points here. One is that one of the data points that I surfaced this past fall that shocked me, and I don't shock easily, was that 50% of the students, it was still shocking, 50% of the students said that they had either blocked or unsubscribed from platforms that were, in their view, spamming them. And when I talk to career centers, what I've been hearing lately is that with their job board, 70 to 80% of the jobs that have been posted have had no applicants. So there's a tremendous market imbalance that's going on. And the irony is that employers aren't getting the applicants that they want and need, and students are just kind of checking out. And I have a quote that I'll read before we wrap up that puts words to the sentiment, but that's another issue that needs to be confronted. And the third just has to do with something that I suspected, but now that I have the data, really grabbed my attention. It's that students consider their experience with smaller, lesser known employers to be more authentic than with larger employers. And I'm going to look down for a second. I apologize for the top of my head, but I want to make sure that I get these data points right. I asked students what their expectation was in terms of bigger, well-known companies having a more impressive recruiting experience. And their average agreement rating on an 10-point scale rather, 8 to 10 is strong agreement, was 7.65. The reality was 6.59, which is a full point lower on a 10-point scale, and that's pretty dramatic. But the more important point, and I just put myself through the torture last night of tabulating qualitative data rather from that study, and I had asked students to identify by name, for confidential reasons, the employer that they thought had the most authentic recruiting process. And then the flip side, the least impressive. And here's what I shook out. 59% of the most impressive employers were smaller companies. 92% of the least authentic, I'm sorry, I said impressive before, I meant authentic. Most authentic were small employers. 92% of the least authentic were large employers. And it all maps to the process, the automation, the lack of personal connection. And I understand with issues of scale, automation can be our friend, but when students don't feel any genuine connection to an employer, here's the data point that I was confusing myself with earlier. 80% of students said that they were more likely to decline or renege on an offer if they didn't feel a genuine connection to an employer. So I suspect that's a big and underreported aspect of what a lot of employers have encountered this past semester. End of rant.
The rant is so powerful, and I think is quantifying lots of things that are trends and themes that we're all seeing, but we haven't had articulated as clearly with those numbers. I know that a lot of people listening to this live and listening back want to ask you the question kind of, so what do we do? And I think from your experience, you're very well placed to say strategically, as people start to think about their 22, 23 hiring plans, what are some of the things they should be thinking about?
Right. Great question, Nikki. And it all comes back to that clear-eyed assessment that I mentioned earlier, because I think there's been such, and of necessity, a focus on tactics lately instead of strategies. And that's, the clock is ticking. I realize the fall will be here before we know it, but I really think I would encourage employers to really be honest with themselves. And I say that knowing full well that employers have saved a lot of money and travel budget to embrace virtual recruiting. I'm not arguing with that. I used to manage a multi-million-dollar budget. I get all the forces at play in terms of trying to use your funding strategically, but I come back to the conventional wisdom. I had an interview last week with somebody from one of the Gannett companies, companies, and he was shocked when I said, because his premise was, this is what students want. They love virtual. They love virtual interaction, and in a lot of ways they do. But it's never been the case with recruiting, and I've seen enough evidence over the past few months, I think most of us have, that their preference is face-to-face. So my recommendation would be to, again, be honest and clear-eyed in terms of whether or not that applies to your organization, which leads me to my final point on this topic, which is this. There's a lot of groupthink that's going on in our profession, and best practices are terrific. I have no issue with them whatsoever. But every organization needs to sort out for itself what's working and what doesn't, because there are no two identical organizations on the planet. And campus brand plays a role. There are just so many moving parts that you need to figure it out. I guess is my best consulting advice, that don't go for the quick fix, because again, we're at an inflection point, and you need real data.
Mary, the chat is exploding. So I'm just going to call out some of the comments that you have engendered with our crowd. Jeffrey Morris said, the problem is many companies are trying to engage students in ways students don't want to be engaged. Instead of spending millions to convince students to attend events, imagine if you gave them what they wanted, experiences, and the money was used to pay the students. Jeffrey, a lot of nodding and thumbs up on that. Cohen Young, great point regarding authenticity, and virtual should not eliminate human connection. My personal publicist, Manny Contaminolis, is pointing out an acronym that I've used in the past, CART. We should be concise, accurate, relevant, and timely. And just a lot of nods and agreement, particularly on that authenticity, which I know you've really brought to the conversation. Mary, let's flip to the campus side. So what is your advice or guidance for career services who are always kind of caught in the middle of what employers are doing and what students want? What would be your advice and guidance for that side of the house?
I think one of the challenges that so many career centers have dealt with, particularly over the last 6 months, is that they don't have the connections with students that they had prior to 2 years ago. So they're kind of trying to meet employers' needs frustrated employers' needs, I might add. To the degree folks on the Career Center can, I would strongly encourage them to use their students as an input source to give advice to employers. And I will pat myself on the back a bit here that so many times, even though employers don't necessarily love what I'm telling them, Career Centers will tell me that's what we hear from our students. So my point here is that's a tremendous resource for you to, and I'm not talking about over surveying them, believe me, because I'm not going to get off on that tangent, but that's a huge problem for both employers and Career Centers as well. And I do worry that we're killing the golden goose, but I'll put a sock in it for now on that. But I know for a fact that Career Centers are feeling that inflection point, probably more so than employers at this point.
And Mary, what are the students telling you right now?
Well, funny you ask. I have 3 quotes that I've got, and they fall into 3 themes, 3 buckets, if you will, one of my technical terms. One, in answer to my text question, what was your biggest surprise about your job search experience? The student said lack of transparency about salary and job description and the amount of ridiculous hoops employers expect job searchers to jump through to simply apply and interview for positions, i.e., submitting pre-taped video interviews, personality tests, survey, hundreds of questions long, having you upload a resume and then fill out a long application with the exact same information. They have no respect for your time and dignity as a human being. And I know that sounds overly dramatic. You cannot believe how much data, qualitative data, I get from students making that exact same inference, that they're not respecting me, and therefore that's no place I want to work. Second theme, and this has to do with why a lot of employers didn't see the quantity of students they were looking for this year. This is an Hispanic engineering major at a major university on the West Coast. She said, I have stellar classmates who gave up on the whole process because it was a waste of time and energy on our end. No one feels seen. And my third, and this one really gets into the weeds, this, and I could not have cherry picked these if I tried. This is a Black IT major at a major Northeastern university who said, and he called out by name, and it's a major employer, companies, campuses all over the country. They invited me for an interview and never got back to me with a date or invite. I consistently followed up with a recruiter, and she gave me false hope by reassuring me that, quote, the date is still to be confirmed, unquote. As the proposed month of the interview round drew near, she started ignoring me, and I've not heard back from her since January 4th. I'm happy I dodged a bullet, but I'm extremely disappointed. I mean, it's clear that they filled the role, but this was underscored completely unethical, and I really want my voice to be heard. And I'm going to bet he told more than a few students about how he was treated by that major recruiter. I'll, again, put a sock in it on my quotes. Those who know my work know that I have a bajillion of them. But those are the 3 major themes that I've heard from students.
There seems to be so much here around student respect, and this is the bit that I find really challenging at the moment. And I think Manny talked about high touch, high tech at the moment. But some of the things, and we see it with our research, is it's just transparency and respect of what the student wants. Get back to me in the time. It's they're actually quite simple things if executed. And I know it's hard at scale, but people are asking for some of the real basics at the moment, it seems.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you one question that you know I'm going to ask you, and please answer it completely honestly, as I know you will, which is from an assessment perspective. You've mentioned some things there, like long processes, things that students don't like. What don't they like assessment-wise? What is tolerable in a process?
Very simple, straightforward answer. Students don't object to being assessed. They see a benefit to that, but it needs to have a few boxes checked. They need to understand why they're being asked to take the test, what it measures, and how they did. And there's a lot of frustration among students who And again, I think a lot of employers assume that students love playing online games, and they do to a degree in their personal lives. But if they feel that they're being asked to do a game that they can't make any sense out of, and by the way, most of them have figured out, they think they've figured out how to cheat on a lot of these commonly used gamification platforms. That aside, if they don't know how they did, if they never hear back after taking the game, if it's unduly time intrusive, that's the distinction. It's whether they believe it serves a purpose or not, and whether or not letting them know how they did in a way that makes sense to them. And I don't think that's a terribly confusing premise.
Is it time for my wrap up?
I think it's time for your wrap up. We've gone very far.
How is that possible?
Very far.
As always, pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of notes for 30 minutes. Thank you, Mary Scott of Scott Resource Group. I have a big theme today, which is back to basics, which is what hasn't changed in the decades that you have been a leader in our field. And so my takeaways, I think, are all fundamentals that unfortunately I think sometimes get lost. Takeaway number one from Mary Scott: be an informed consumer of research. Be skeptical of what you see and keep your own data and counsel of what works in your organization and what doesn't. Don't believe everything you read. Number two, be strategic and not just focused on tactics. Avoid groupthink with other employers. Find out what works for your organization and what lessons you've learned over the past 2.5 years and apply them to your strategy moving forward. Takeaway number three is that theme of authenticity, which is that students don't want to feel that they're inundated with outreach, that they are being spammed. And that's why so many jobs have no applications. And in fact, why, as you mentioned, many smaller, lesser known companies have been more authentic and appealing in the process than some of the big players. And finally, the last takeaway, which I think I'm realizing we don't talk about enough, which is just respect the student. It goes back to the basics of respecting the student and candidate. They feel that. And I'm thinking of the quotes that you read about students going through the recruiting process. I tend to deal with Gen Zs when they're in a company and perhaps unhappy. And one of the constant verbatims that I always share with employers is the young employees who say, nobody knew my name. It was just so basic a form of respect to know people's names and treat them as individuals. So thank you for reminding us of so many of the fundamentals of our field and why we do what we do. And now, Nikki, I'm going to pass it to you because we all need to brazenly promote our NACE sessions. Nikki.
Well, you know the time of our session. So do you want to go with our session first and then we'll get Mary to share hers?
Does that mean, Nikki, that you don't know the time of our session?
Right here. Thank you. I'm going to be there, Lindsay. I'm going to be there. I promise. Look, it's here now.
To all of our friends, and thank you to our fabulous producer, Haley, who keeps us honest to make sure we know the time and puts it on the screen at the NACE conference coming up in Portland, Oregon in June on Wednesday, June 8th. Nikki and I will be presenting from 4:15 to 5:15 when we know a lot of people might want to be napping. So our lure is that we're going to take you out to cocktails after our session. And we have some special gifts for those who attend. We are going to be talking about data-driven approaches to recruiting. Mary, may I invite you to brazenly promote your session at the NACE?
You certainly may. Same day, Wednesday, June 8th. I am one of the leadoff batters. I am on from 8:45 to 9:45. So probably we'll be fighting the early morning urge to nap for those of us from the East Coast, certainly. I promise I will not during my session at any rate. But my topic is, and Manny teed it up for me perfectly, because the question I'm posing is relationships versus transactions the new high touch versus high tech? So loads of data to share. And for those of you who have heard me present before, I have one of my blaring glimpses of the obvious, my BGOs. So stay tuned for that.
So we've got skunks, eye rolls, elephants, golden geese, and blaring, what is it? Glaring Statements
Glimpse
of the
of the
obvious.
BGO.
BGOs, fabulous. Nikki, do you want to invite
Amazing.
people to the Capfinity booth?
Yeah, we will be at booth 300. Stop by, particularly if you'd like to try some virtual reality. And we have got a lovely team of Capfinity folks attending. So if anyone wants to join us, that would be wonderful. I'm just laughing to myself because you can have breakfast with Mary and afternoon tea with Lindsay and Nikki. That's the way we're going to bookend Wednesday the 8th. So without further ado, just to mention our upcoming guests, Lindsay and I will not be live June 3rd, but we will be live again the week after. And we have Nicole Urens from Latham & Watkins and Heather Kettner, who are going to talk about an approach to authentic recruitment within the law sector. So we're really looking forward to welcoming our special guests then. Mary, thank you so much for being so giving with your time, your wisdom, your authenticity, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to meet you in person. I promise not to be eye-rolling in the front row, but I will definitely maybe find something elephant-orientated to keep the themes going. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great weekend when it reaches you, wherever you are in the world, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.